Welcome to the Blockchain VC, a podcast about crypto and the digital assets ecosystem. My name is Tomer Federman, and I'm the managing partner at Federman Capital. We invest in the most promising blockchain startups across the globe. I have more than 15 years of experience in tech, and before starting the fund, I was on the product side at Facebook, where I led product strategy and global growth of some of Facebook's major ad products. Previously, I also lived in Silicon Valley for a few years, where I attended Stanford Business School. You can find me on Twitter at Tomer Federman. Before we begin, please note that this podcast is for informational purposes only, and all the opinions expressed on this show, either by guests or me, do not reflect the opinions of Federman Capital. Nothing on the Blockchain VC podcast represents an investment or financial advice. Please do your own research. Also, if you like this episode of the Blockchain VC and want to help bring more awareness to the space, I'd really appreciate it if you can rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. This only takes a few seconds and helps get the word out. Okay, let's do this. My guest today is Kathleen Breitman, co-founder of Tezos. Kathleen, really excited to welcome you to the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, of course. So to get started, before we deep dive on Tezos, would love to learn more about your background.
Sure. I graduated from college in 2012. I was a philosophy major, but unfortunately all the philosophy factories were closed when I graduated. So I went to work in New York. I was working out of a venture capital fund at a startup that was in duress with a guy who was a more seasoned consultant and was trying to help that company turn around. I did that for like the better part of a year. I was kind of tired of being in a very depressing environment, and so I went to work at a hedge fund called Bridgewater, which has, I guess its culture is more popular now because it's CEO.
That's a pretty big one.
Yeah, it's the largest, right? And it's a cool place to work. It's like it's a very exotic environment, and there's a lot of really smart people there. So that was fun, but it definitely wasn't my calling. And so I was sort of left out in the wilderness for what felt like a little while. And I kind of figured that consulting would be a good way for me to see a lot of different positions, a lot of different industries in a short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So I joined Accenture in, I guess like 2014. Around that time, or in parallel with that time, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general became more popular.
So when was that?
Like 2013, 2014.
Okay, got it.
And that's like when Bitcoin hit $1,000 per Bitcoin the first time, and that got a lot of press, right, and a lot of excitement. And my dear sweet husband, who I married around that time, wouldn't shut up about Bitcoin, or Ethereum, or any,
rightfully so.
Yeah, or any of the projects.
Sounds like a smart guy.
Oh yes. Well, he's truly a polymath, and what's fun about Arthur is that he gets super excited about ideas, and he just like goes down a rabbit hole. And you can choose to go down there with him, and he'll graciously take you there. I remember like during college, he was really into like tensegrity and like tension bridges. Like that was his thing for a few months, and he would just come up with new facts that I didn't know because that wasn't something I was terribly interested in. And he would just tell me about it for hours on end.
What made him focus on Bitcoin and Ethereum?
Well, he's always been super interested in money. He had a career in finance for the better part of a decade. I think that cryptocurrencies definitely force you to think or rethink about what you think money is, and how to transmit value more broadly. And so that really tickled something that he was interested in from like a purely intellectual perspective, but also he had quite a bit of professional insight into how some of the assumptions were playing out in the Bitcoin, white paper, for example, which is meant to be a little antagonistic to banks. And obviously you can have Arthur on the show and he can opine on his views.
Right.
Don't take my word. He's quite capable of articulating himself. But definitely his obsession with cryptocurrencies, sort of forced me to have if you can't beat them, join them moment. Uh, and and so I got progressively more interested in the space. I admittedly was a lot more skeptical than he was, and I think that actually like spurred a fair amount of good discussions and good thinking over what value it had, if any at all. Right? It looks like a bit of a long shot of the technology. Anyway, um, Arthur, was really opining a lot about the cryptocurrency stuff. And around some point in 2015, when I was working at Accenture, my worlds collided because I came across an internal memo on Bitcoin that was just like comically bad. It was like really, it didn't get anything right. And
Really interesting.
yeah, it was pretty bad. And so I had a moment where I was like, wait a second, like I know about this. So I piped up and I was like, you guys, it's not just that this was incorrect. It's that like you didn't even get things that were in the Bitcoin like white paper like copy pasted correctly. And so that prompted a lot more senior people to take notice of what I was offering or what I was saying about the technology. I got more interested in kind of getting through the technical implementation of it, and I wound up finding a little niche for myself at Accenture with the crypto stuff, which was nice. I made some really good friends in the firm.
Working on crypto in 2015 at Accenture, that
Well,
must have been quite an experience.
it just wasn't that interesting, right? Like, like when you're a consultant, you're not necessarily incented to like be on the cutting edge of something. The consultancies usually make their money on implementing more tried and true mechanisms, not necessarily being on the vanguard of cutting edge technology. Um, and especially with a firm like Accenture, which is publicly traded, there really isn't a very strong appetite for carving out a new practice area. And this is a frustration that not just me, but other people at the firm had shared, and subsequently have left, as a consequence of this. Um, and that stinks, right? But for someone
Hmm.
who's like 25 or 26, well, I guess I was 25. I started to look around for greener pastures. I wound up interviewing at actually mostly not like blockchain firms. Mostly, I was just looking through my emails the other day. I was mostly looking at like positions in data management and things like that at small startups. But basically, I wanted something that was a little bit more oriented towards growth. And I felt as though I had received like a pretty decent education at Accenture, that I could go out and be a good operator at another business. Um, and
Right. Which office, by the way, of Accenture were you based at?
New York. I was living
Ah,
in,
New York.
yeah, I lived in New York for most of this, and at some point, R3 reached out, or Tim Swanson reached out to me, and wanted me to interview at R3, and that was pretty cut and dry, and where I could probably gain the most leverage on my expertise that I had cultivated until then. So I worked at R3 for a brief period of
Hmm.
time, and this was when they were kind of transitioning from having coordinated consortium to thinking through what their product strategy be with Corda, which is a open source project that they've been working on with the different banks that are involved with them. Around this time, uh, basically, the idea of Tezos, or the ideas that are promoted in the Tezos, or presented in the Tezos position paper, um, came to the fore because the DAO hack took place. Um, and I assume that if someone's listening to the Blockchain VC podcast, they're familiar with the events that transpired then.
Hopefully, yeah.
But basically, the idea of having a formal mechanism to resolve disputes, was super attractive at that point, and having a formal mechanism to instantiate upgrades isn't a far cry from that. The idea is,
Hmm.
presenting a legitimate upgrade, and that's what Tezos, effectively does. Tezos can be many things, but at its core, Tezos is a piece of software that allows for the instantiation of upgrades to the protocol using the consensus of token holders, and
Hmm.
it's a pretty simple idea. um,
So we'll get to Tezos in a second. So you're working at R3 or Corda, and then like the DAO hack happens, and then you realize wow, I can develop a solution to address some of these pain points? Or
Oh, well,
how did you think about starting Tezos?
well, the Tezos position paper was published in 2014, and the white paper was published soon after. And so there had been a group of people already working on, an implementation of Tezos. So it wasn't something that like came up in 2016. It was something that I think people caught on to.
Got it.
How transformative it could be in 2016 because of this event that basically fell in line with some of the theses that are expanded upon in the position paper and the less
Hmm.
accessible white paper. So the notion of Tezos became more popular in 2016, but it had already been had about 2 years of work um, towards it. But for a while, I think the team wasn't sure exactly when or if Tezos would be released or in what manner the code base would be um, presented or exposed. But it became obvious, I think, in 2016 that the ideas that are presented 2014 had teeth. And as these networks grow, there's only going to be more disputes and more politics amongst the people who have tokens in these networks. And without a proper way to adjudicate, I guess, different preferences and different matters of taste in a legitimizing way, it is quite hard to fathom these networks expanding in a decentralized fashion. And so, that was kind of the insight that I think led to a renewed popularity in the ideas for Tezos, which was great timing for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because 2014, I don't think I was like quite ready to really jump in, and by 2016, I think I knew enough about this myself and the way I operated that I felt very comfortable, quitting my job and going into this full time. And my responsibilities were mostly like to oversee any sort of development that needed to take place and sort of grow and think through what the project could be over the next few years.
Hmm. So sounds like you had a strong conviction about the concept behind Tezos, and you at that point you felt strongly enough, even though at any point this is a bold move to quit your job and
Yeah,
pursue something new. But
yeah. I mean, I think if you look at like my profile as like a person, like I'm pretty risk averse.
says the entrepreneur.
Well, I'm an entrepreneur now, right? But like, I think there's a really great Paul Graham essay that says like, don't send your kids to like an Ivy League school because the worst tax that you get is like a complete aversion to risk. And and basically, anytime I did something like vaguely adventurous, I would retreat back to the thing that was more closed off and a little bit more less risky. So this was a pretty big jump for me. But Arthur was extraordinarily supportive of me going on full time, and if I didn't feel as though I had his encouragement and faith, I wouldn't have done it. It
Hmm.
was a pretty big and delightful part of the story there. But yeah, I quit my job and I sort of didn't know what to do next. But there's a lot of stuff that had to be done because Tezos had largely just been, a small, team of people, and we needed to kind of pull in other talents I think understand what this project could be, and then fast forward a year and a half later, and the Tezos network launches to a lot of excitement and fanfare from hundreds of actually tens of thousands of people in over 80 countries in the world.
So what is Tezos, Kathleen, for listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah, so Tezos is a piece of open source software. Um, it is a blockchain with smart contracts. And its main differentiation from other smart contract platforms is that it has a formal mechanism for instantiating upgrades to the protocol in a decentralized fashion, meaning there isn't just like one person or one entity who signs off on upgrades to the protocol. It's done through sort of the consensus of people who have tokens.
So how does that work? Because I know you have a pretty innovative model in terms of governance. Can you describe that a bit more? Let's say you want to upgrade the protocol. What happens next? How does that happen?
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of funny because the actual governance mechanism for Tezos can change itself. It gets very meta very quickly, but in the first sort of version of the governance model, basically people who validate the ledger, was traditionally the role of miners in Bitcoin. Tezos has as token holders who are able to assume that role because it's a proof of stake based network. And those same people basically vote on upgrades to the protocol in a I guess uh, tiered fashion. At first they signal their desire to basically test out something, and then based on the results of a trial period, they allow for the upgrade to be legitimized and to basically be pushed out to the rest of the network.
I see. And assuming the more tokens I have, the more votes I have?
Yeah, so there's no necessarily no concept of one person one vote. It's weighted by the token ownership of the entity.
The token ownership of the entity. Okay, so isn't that like one token, one vote?
Yeah, exactly.
So basically, okay, the more tokens I hold, the more sway I have in pushing decisions based on my own viewpoint.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, got it. And other than that, any other major distinctions between Tezos and other smart contract platforms like Ethereum, EOS, Definity, Cardano, and so forth?
I mean, so far that's a pretty big point of differentiation, right? Like, I think there's a fundamental like difference in philosophy between Ethereum and Tezos. Ethereum has like sort of a 2.0 phase that they're going to go through over the next few months, and that basically has to boil the ocean. Tezos can provide for incremental progress because there's a set governance mechanism that has timelines associated with it, and can basically imbue gradual progress as opposed to boiling the ocean, as we'd say in consulting.
Okay. And I know also you have a slightly different consensus algorithm, right? If you can talk about that for a second, about liquid proof of stake
Yeah,
versus just normal proof of stake and delegated proof of stake.
yeah. So again, pretty big differentiation from Ethereum, which doesn't have proof of stake. But there's basically a few different models of proof of stake. The reason we call it liquid proof of stake in the Tezos community is because basically delegation isn't fixed. You have rights associated with your ownership of the token in the network. As I mentioned before, like voting being one of them. And basically, you can assign those rights to someone else who can validate the ledger on your behalf. And so you can very easily switch from one delegate to another if you think this person is acting unscrupulously or you disagree with their governance philosophy or participation or lack thereof. And basically, the ability to move very seamlessly between different delegates is a distinguishing feature of Tezos as opposed to let's say something like EOS, where a delegation is fixed to a certain number of validators, and you're sort of stuck a little bit. And there have been quite a bit of politics associated with that in the EOS network, right? That there hasn't been in the Tezos network.
What I find really fascinating in your model is that basically you can choose, right? On the one hand, you can choose to go, I guess, the representative democracy route and have a delegate vote on your behalf. On the other hand, you can just decide not to do that and you vote directly.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, a lot of different people. I guess basically when the Genesis block that was proposed by the foundation in June 2018 had a lot of participation from people who I guess you would describe mostly as like hobbyists, or who are doing these types of services part time, or they weren't exactly like full time professionals who focused on the software. And I think that's great. Like that was very organic, very community based. But over the last, I would say, like 6 to 9 months, we've seen more institutions and exchanges sort of put their hat into the ring and offer validation services for people who own Tezos tokens. And that's been like things like Coinbase, so on and so forth, Kraken most recently. And then simultaneously, there have been a bunch of people at like places like Obsidian Systems, which is a development shop in New York, basically creating software that facilitates, baking or validating the ledger, more easy for individuals. And that's with things like the Ledger hardware wallet, and that's great. Basically, you're appealing to many different types of people. Some people are less technical, but they still ought to have their voice heard, and making it very easy for them to participate, whether it's self-baking or whether it's delegation to a professional service that really takes the time and energy to think through and participate in the governance model. That's all fantastic because it basically widens the input into the network. And I don't think that people who are purely technical always have the right answers. I think that you do need a lot of sense checks from different voices in a network to make the best decisions possible. And so the more accessible we make baking, whether it's through institutions or sort of this cottage industry that has arisen in the Tezos community, or through self-baking, that just strengthens the network because it makes it more inclusive.
And just to clarify, when you say baking, that's basically staking, right? People using their tokens to validate.
Yeah, exactly. I think baking is a really cute image of
Right.
creating blocks and making it fun. And also, the team that
It's in the oven now.
yeah, it's a lot of Frenchmen on the original original docket, so they like their baked goods. And yeah, I think it's a cute little moniker. It's hard to resist saying it sometimes in interviews because it's a little confusing. But yes, it's basically validating the ledger.
Right. And is there a concern, Kathleen, about some of these exchanges becoming too dominant on the platform? Meaning, for instance, let's say a lot of people start staking on the Coinbase and the Krakens of the world. They get a lot of power and say in the future direction of the protocol.
Yeah, I think that would be a bigger issue if this was a traditional DPoS network like EOS. I think it's less of an issue with Tezos because there is that ability to basically take away that power. That's something that the community gives to people at Coinbase. And there's an understanding there that that's some of the rights they're providing to them. And if you over time see that the network isn't evolving the way you'd like, it's quite simple with the existing model to basically take your rights and assign them to someone else if you don't want to self-bake. But I think the way that the technology is evolving and the community is evolving is that a lot of people want to bake for themselves. And the sort of marginal person might want to delegate to a service, but mostly folks are coming to find that it's more accessible to do a DIY project around this. And I think that's encouraging. I think there's, Coinbase and Kraken are really popular companies in the space, and I think it's good to have the people there working on creating software and creating best practices around validation. And certainly some of the feedback that they give other developers in the community is extraordinarily valuable because they come to this with a different set of skills and a different set of insights into how these networks work. And I think that's valuable and it contributes in its own way. But I think ultimately, this technology is predicated on the idea of taking power out of a select few people. That's almost exclusively what the Tezos position paper talks about. Is basically giving decision making power back to folks. And I think the test will be, do people actually want to be a part of that? And in the Tezos community, I think that the answer to that is absolutely yes. There's a really strong cultural push towards participating in governance and debating the governance mechanisms. And I feel as though the rights given and afforded to Tezos token holders has emboldened them to really be enthusiastic about the governance mechanism. And that's unique to Tezos, and it's unique to the Tezos culture as far as I've observed. So that makes me really excited, and it gives me hope that this isn't going to just become concentrated in one or two validators. But if it is, it's purely on the preference of the people who have tokens, and so you kind of have to concede that point if that's what they really want.
Yeah, one of the things I also find really interesting about Tezos is just the strong community that you guys seem to foster around the project.
Yeah.
I've noticed that, even ahead of discussion, right? So I posted online asking folks what they would like me to discuss with you, and got a ton of response. And I just noticed people seem to be very passionate about Tezos in general.
Yeah.
And obviously, you had a huge ICO, right? You raised like 232 million.
Well, I didn't raise that money. The Tezos Foundation did.
The Tezos Foundation, right?
Yeah, I haven't earned a cent from this. But I mean, yeah, there were 30,000 contributors to the Tezos fundraiser in 2017, and it was a really widespread, and it's a really diverse group of people who did that.
So one of the things I'm really curious about, I see a lot of interesting, very technical people in the space, working on some cutting edge stuff. Oftentimes, what they fail to do is build a strong community around that. Having a great tech solution that's great, but it's not enough. You need to drive adoption and you need to build community. How did you guys do that?
Well, I think the big misunderstanding in this space is that this is just a technical solution that needs to exist inside a vacuum or some sort of.
Yeah.
I think this is ultimately a piece of coordination technology, and coordination technology is only interesting when you have many people who are sitting at the table and offering contesting viewpoints. That's how these things grow more robust and how they become designed better. I think. I mean, listen, Arthur and I are the co-founders of this project, but the whole reason that Tezos exists is because we saw, quite a bit of technical oligarchies sort of start to emerge in the early days of other cryptocurrencies, and we thought that was fundamentally not a way to inculcate the best in innovations. I don't think you can rely on the judgment of a group of core developers to make the best decisions overall. And so, Tezos is unique because I think it's one of the few cryptocurrencies that aims to basically obviate the people who, would normally be in charge of other cryptocurrencies, which is, the core developers who are, sitting and sort of dictating who gets a say in which version is canonical of the software. And so that empowers people, right? Like that is a very sincere and a very legitimate way to limit your influence on a certain network and also empower people. And I think that people respond to respect. I think that people respond to having their voice acknowledged. I come into a weird place in this because people obviously pay attention to things that I say related to Tezos because I do get that co-founder status, and that's why I get news with nice people like yourself. But but I'm not there in the community to coddle anyone. I'm just a small voice in there, and I'm not really determining anything. I have no tokens. I have no teeth in this really.
But don't you have tokens that are gonna vest over time?
I could one day, but I don't at the moment, and and so I genuinely have nothing to do with the success of the network since its launch because I'm not really not really a part of it. But what I do think the design allows for, which makes people genuinely much more excited about Tezos than many other projects, is that the algorithm, the way it was first designed, gives them a tremendous amount of responsibility and a tremendous amount of respect, and I think people respond to that.
Right. A funny story, by the way, when I posted, I think a couple of days ago about, the questions, I accidentally made the mistake of calling you the CEO of Tezos.
Oh,
and I got such a backlash, Tezos has no CEO and we control our own fate and so forth. And yeah, it was really interesting, which I guess very much relates to what you just mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, it's very true. Like, there are many articles written about Arthur and I from like, yeah, I guess a lot of people in like the Ethereum community and the Bitcoin community about how Arthur and I were very like low EQ, for not like trying to like, I don't know, do the sort of I guess BSE, like, oh, Tezos is the best, Tezos is the best. My whole thing has always been like the technology speaks for itself, and ultimately, it puts a lot of responsibility in the hands of the people who are part of the network. And for this to live or die, it needs to exist, outside of our personalities. And I think it very much does. And the last like year and a half has really proven that that's the case.
So, what is your role in the network? Because obviously, you provide the guidance and lead the way.
I mean, I don't know. I don't particularly think so. I mean, I'm
No?
contributing to
Okay.
the Tezos network in a new way. I have a new company that wants to create infrastructure that will allow for on ramps and off ramps to these networks in I guess a more elegant way than how they exist today. I think the UX for a lot of blockchain based assets are atrocious, and so I seek to remedy that. And the way that I'm going to do that is by creating a video game. And the way that this ties into one another is that I think the infrastructure and the designs that I have to come up with to make this video game use a blockchain passively to organize its economy will have very virtuous technological innovations that can be used in other use cases and applications in Tezos, but also Ethereum and other smart contract platforms.
Got it. So, other than that video game, which we can touch on in a second, you don't really have any special say in the governance of
I
Tezos.
mean, I have no tokens, so that explicitly means no. um, but I try my best to engage with the community if people ask me questions and like if they ask my opinion on things. For the record, no one has asked me my opinion on any of the last two upgrades to the Tezos network. So,
Wow, that's crazy.
yeah, I think it's great. I mean, I really encourage people to like take this on to themselves and and hopefully they feel empowered by the rights that the network has baked into it. But really, I guess I don't want to belabor this too much, but it really is the case that if you read the position paper, it's a good thing that I I don't really have a vocal say. Like that's explicitly what we're trying to guard against is relying on one or two people to set the tone for the network.
And what do you say, regardless of your position, just in general, I'm curious, to people who are skeptical about decentralized organizations and the ability of the crowd to manage an entity or a company?
Well, I think I think a decentralized network is a lot different than a decentralized organization. I might be a little stodgy in how I treat people, but like my current company is not a decentralized wherewithal. Like I do think that managerial leadership is very important in a company. However, I think that in a network that aspires to transmit value, there is no shortage of a need for multiple actors at the table, and generally having these things live and die by network effects, meaning the more actors that are at the table, the more robust and pervasive the network becomes. And I think that that's the goal with a piece of open source software like Tezos that aspires to create systems of account over time and have persistence in that. That's much different than if you're at a company that's trying to create a piece of software, having some sort of loosey goosey like holacracy is kind of a recipe for failure, in my opinion.
So you draw the distinction between a company and a network. For a network, it does make sense to have decentralized governance, and maybe it's even preferable. But for a company, it's a completely different story.
Yeah, I think I think there's a very strong disconnect between corporate governance and network governance in a cryptocurrency, right? So
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't know. It's so early, right? That I feel like nobody really knows at this point. I mean, all the crypto networks are fairly new, other than Bitcoin, I guess.
yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, I'm happy insofar as the the thesis around some of the more contentious aspects of Tezos have played out the way that I had hoped that they would. Like the network has been able to upgrade itself, twice so far, and working on a third time. And that's like a remarkable achievement in its own right. So that at least goes to show that the mechanism that was at least first presented to the community does work, and that's encouraging. But I do think that there are benefits to centralization in management of a piece of software, and I think that the uphill battle is finding a decentralized model that works, that is less abusive of people than something kind of loosey goosey, the way we see in other open source projects.
So how do partnerships like the one with Coinbase come about? If the network is decentralized in its governance.
Well, I don't know what you mean by the partnerships. I mean, Coinbase lists the Tezos token, and it has a part of its custody service, but that was something that I think Coinbase did on its own volition.
I see. So there's no coordination with folks on the Tezos side of things.
Well, I mean, I think you have to basically clarify what you mean by the Tezos side of things, because there's like a network with tens of thousands of participants and token holders, and I'm sure some of them reached out to Coinbase, and that's how Coinbase knew that this would be a viable option for them as a business. But to the best of my knowledge, Coinbase wanted to do this, and that was why they developed the part of their custody group, and also listed the token and did all that fun stuff.
Yeah, and it seems like you had a pretty strong year just in general, right? So yes, last month Coinbase introduced staking, and I saw somewhere that it also drove the number of addresses of people who have more than 0.1 Tezos token XTZ to above 100K addresses. And just in general, it seems like Tezos has been growing quite a bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a really good idea and a really good piece of software, and the folks who've been attracted to the project are in general super serious and smart. And I think, people take notice of that, and they want to know more about what's going on. And because Tezos is one of the few projects that has really made good on all of the ideas that it, presented to people, I think that basically just delivering in this space differentiates you pretty strongly.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, you asked about the difference between different smart contract networks. I'm like, shit, Tezos is one of the few that actually is proof of stake, right? And actually has a governance model that consistently works. It has a really robust community that's extraordinarily diverse, not just in geography, but also in expertise. And yeah, I mean, that just creates a virtuous cycle. Like when you have a ton of people who are super interested in working with the piece of software, you get good results. And I feel as though other projects, because they don't allow their communities to have such an obvious, straightforward voice in the network, they tend to alienate people who aren't just purely developers or purely technical. And I feel as though that's a big failing of this space, is to think that everyone has to learn to write a smart contract in order to be a valid participant. I think that the governance mechanism in Tezos is a much better test of enthusiasm and I guess its strength than any number of smart contracts deployed in it right now. At least the thesis, or one of the more cultural things that we hold true in Tezos is that not everyone needs to be able to write a smart contract. Typically we want them to use them, but it's not super necessary to be technical to participate in this ecosystem, and that's, I think, very empowering for people.
Yeah, I think in general, again, it goes back to what we talked earlier. I think you take this pragmatic approach, which is not just about the technical specs, but it goes beyond that.
Yeah. Well, it's a piece of traditional technology, and if you don't acknowledge that, you're going to wind up, talking a lot about wonky moon math, and maybe you'll engineer yourself to death, but you won't have a fraction of the community that a project like Tezos does.
Yeah, I mean, when people buy a new iPhone, right, they don't necessarily know the specs. It just works and it works smoothly.
Oh,
And
the sort of adage I've been giving, and I do I guess conferences now is I aspire for blockchains to have the same status as TCP/IP. I don't open my
yeah,
laptop and say like I sure do hope this email is getting to someone else. It just works, right? And basically, the governance mechanism in Tezos is meant to instantiate upgrades and innovations and technical choices that give that sort of efficiency as its end game. It just happens to be the case that we're quite early in the cycle for these networks becoming super efficient and super robust in the same way that TCP/IP is, where anyone can pretty much use it. Um, but it'll get there. Like you have to have some faith in people to problem solve.
oh yeah, absolutely. I bet most people who use email don't even know what TCP/IP is.
Yeah,
So what's next for Tezos? Like, what are you most excited about? What's on your roadmap?
yeah. I mean, Um, I'm heads down working on uh, the game, and we're getting towards the point where we can start to publicly talk about that. So that's super exciting for me because we had to basically come up with original solutions for auctioning off these cards and giving the ability to rent these cards, and also an original solution for custodying them for people that doesn't ask for them to download MetaMask, for example. Um, and I think that's all well and good. So that's where my focus is.
Oh, that's a big one.
Yes, it is.
Downloading MetaMask is such a pain.
Well, I think it alienates like 99% of normal people.
It's not really usable for the 99% of, yeah,
Yeah.
not early adopters.
I mean, I think that basically we're at capacity with people who are really enthusiastic about blockchains. Those people are all pretty much bought in and they're willing to download MetaMask to play a game. I want to grow the use of this software beyond just people who are very enthusiastic about its potential implications on like the financial system or whatever gets you going, whatever got you into this. Um, and so, my solution is mostly meant to be something where you don't know that you're using a blockchain. Like that's my goal, and that's the standard I'm holding myself to. So it's taken a little while for me to ideate about this and think through the user experience. But I'm pretty pleased with what we've come up with, and we'll be announcing some sort of alpha in the near future. But I'll be slaughtered by my team if I say dates now because they'll have to work towards that. So
Come on, give us a date.
well, I mean, we're shooting for Q1, but that's like always subject to change. So that's what I'm most excited about is what I'm doing selfishly, and then in tandem with that, obviously. There's a lot of participation in the Tezos governance model. There's an ongoing, basically effort for its third upgrade cycle, which is called Carthage. And people can vote on that and see if they want to test it out and potentially use it as an upgrade. I haven't been following that as much as I had been the first two upgrades, but there are many people in the Tezos community. If you merely search Carthage, Tezos, you'll find lots of opinions and lots of resources to find out more. And yeah, I mean, in tandem with that, I guess I've been super excited to see some of the people who are starting to contribute to the ecosystem, and I know a lot of folks are working on different upgrades, and that's all fun and cool to see.
Right. So can you talk a bit more about the game?
Uh, yeah, sure.
I'd love to hear more. And as I mentioned, like I posted on Twitter and a couple of folks also, I think were very curious. Is that cause when you say the game? Is that the one?
Yeah, so I mean, Coast is the name of the company, and basically, Coast exists to introduce markets into digital economies. I say this because there are many sort of um, facets of the web where the advertising model for monetization has either eviscerated or severely distorted its economies for different industries. I think online video games are one of the most bastardized because basically in the mid 2000s you had to do the free to play model if you wanted to monetize a video game online. And for collectible card games, this has been particularly taxing in the sense that the free-to-play model strongly discourages exploration in these games. And so people play more conservative play patterns for these collectible card games like Magic the Gathering, Hearthstone, whatever, than they historically would in their paper or analog formats. Because we can use a blockchain to basically allow for the free trade of these assets with people in their peer group or with the marketplace that we'll set up, we allow for more experimentation than has ever been able to be programmed before. And we're able to basically provide an alternative to the free-to-play model for collectible card games. So I teamed up with, 3 really talented people who were really into Magic the Gathering to create this original game that we call Emergence. So we're working towards releasing that. And the idea there is that the marketplace and the ownership model are tied to the Tezos blockchain, but basically the game I think is funded in its own right. And I think that's what's been missing from the blockchain plus gaming space is like an actually fun game that just happens to use a cryptocurrency or a blockchain-based model to provide liquidity. I don't think people really care that much about ownership for the sake of ownership. If they did, Facebook wouldn't be a multi-billion-dollar company because clearly people don't care that much about owning their data. I think what people care about is basically optionality and being able to recreate the fun play patterns that existed in these analog versions of collectible card games.
The collectible part is really why you need a blockchain, right? It's because like the transfer and I guess the purchase of different non-fungible assets.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these things have to, people have to want to play them over and over again in order for them to really be an interesting collectible item. And that's where the game ties in. But basically, we're using a blockchain to allow people to own and trade their assets freely, but we're also using it as a coordinating mechanism by using a token bonding curve, basically to auction off and set a price for the asset at the get-go.
Ah, interesting. So sounds like there's 2 really unique things here. A is like what you just said about auctioning it, and B, it's really the secondary market, right? So let's say you have a game, but you don't use a blockchain, trading these assets and selling them. My understanding is, and I'm not a big gamer, but my understanding is it's quite difficult to do at the moment, and oftentimes it's not really even part of the game, right? So people try to look for all these markets to do that, even though it's not really the intent of the developer.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summation. There's obviously a lot of stuff going on in different models, but if you want to just paint a picture, it's basically the case that a game like Magic the Gathering or any collectible card game, Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, whatever, all have 2 components to them. There's like a battle sequence where you have cards that have different powers and different abilities that can go head to head with each other. And that's, one component. But then there's sort of a meta game or an economic game wherein you do only have like a finite number of cards that you can bring into these battles. And so strategizing about which ones you want to pick and choose requires the ability to kind of like trade and explore these things because they do shift over time and play patterns become differentiated as people pick up on what's a strength and what's a weakness of a card or a strategy of cards. And so without the sort of freewheeling exploration that facilitates this metagame, there's a richness that's lost to them. And players in digitized versions of these games often complain about the fact that they don't have as much exploratory capability because of the way these markets are set up, where they'll have 70% spreads and they'll be able to grind things back to dust to buy more cards, but it's at a very, very, predatory rate.
Which is why I think gaming is such an interesting vertical.
Because it's a fully digitized economy.
Yeah, exactly.
We talk a lot about how blockchains are going to change finance, but there's this whole other world that exists that doesn't have the same ticky-tacky on-ramps and off-ramps, and why aren't we trying to innovate there first?
Right, and the behavior already exists, right? Like so many people already purchase digital assets using various games. It's already there.
Yeah, and what I like about it as well is there's a cultural tie-in wherein, people who are into these games tend to have sort of a hacker mentality in the first place. If you're constantly going into, face-to-face battle, that does lend itself to a certain sort of aggression in your thinking. And my co-founder Zvi Moshowitz is sort of hyper competitive, and he could be anyone he wants to be, right? But he just happens to have this extraordinarily amazing adversarial mindset, and he's constantly thinking about ways that things can go horribly awry. And it's fun to watch because it reminds me a lot of my husband when he's thinking through engineering problems in the same vein. So it's familiar enough that I enjoy working with him, but it's also fun and new that he orients himself towards gaming rather than Arthur, I guess, who's been more passionate about Tezos for the last few years.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how it's going to play out. My sense is gaming is probably going to be one of the first verticals where blockchain is really going to make a big difference in the coming years.
Yeah, I hope so.
I don't know who the winners are going to be, but I think there's a huge opportunity there.
Well, I mean, if you knew, I hope you put in your VC hat to good.
Yeah, well, that's the aim. For sure. Kind of shifting gears a bit towards the end of our conversation, just curious, taking a step back from Tezos and thinking about the market more broadly. Curious, what's your view on Bitcoin? Are you long there?
I mean, I like Bitcoin just fine. I think it does what it says it's going to do, and that's a pretty strong differentiator in this space. So it's it's a great piece of technology, and it's been beaten up and tried and true quite a bit. I mean, obviously, I think Tezos has certain advantages over time, but these networks obviously benefit a lot from the people who participate in them, and Bitcoin does have probably the strongest name brand of any cryptocurrency, and you can't neglect that. And I have a lot of respect for it. So it's a cool piece of tech. No one's perfect and nothing is perfect, but it seems to be doing quite well.
Yeah, and when you say it does what it's meant to do, you mean store of value? Like you're referring to the store of value narrative?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's at least how I think of it.
Yeah, I think most people do at this point.
Yeah, but it's cool to see. It's cool to see things like the Lightning Network, pop up. And admittedly, I don't follow. I don't follow the space all that closely. I know that sounds kind of silly, but I really just try to focus on helping people out within the Tezos ecosystem where I can, and thinking through my own way that I can contribute to it. And I try not to poke my head up too much from that. But my understanding is that Bitcoin has had some like cool innovations over the last few years, and with respect to like the Lightning Network and a few other things. I also have seen like quite a bit of resonance from like its own little weird civil wars. So there's some parts of it that I think could be improved, but by and large, it's a pretty cool piece of technology.
What about the blockchain space more broadly? Anything other than Tezos, obviously, anything you're excited about or looking forward to, say, in the next 2, 3, 5 years? We talked about gaming as one vertical that sounds like you're passionate about.
Well, gaming, I think the go-to-market on that was really appealing for me. I could get something out the door in, a year and some change. I think most other use cases require a bit more, tender loving care, and a little bit more coordination and come in at a higher price point. So that's why I liked gaming as something to focus on. But I think there's a lot of cool research being done on things like ZK snarks and ways to preserve privacy. I think that's cool and worth looking into. Not just for privacy, but also for compression. So there's some cool projects coming out like Coda, which is being built out of a team in San Francisco. That's also no Camel. I think there's a lot of interesting experimentation going on with the Cosmos ecosystem, which is in many ways sort of an orthogonal thesis to Tezos. Tezos talks a lot about the position paper talks a lot about basically imbuing innovations into the core protocol. Cosmos is much more experimental at the hub stage and tries to have more of a thesis of a blockchain in every pod, a consortium in every garage, to riff on a famous saying from a U.S. president. and more oriented towards like people having tokens for different purposes. So that's interesting. That's worth watching and keeping tabs on. And then there's a lot of cool work being done with Ethereum for their like 2.0 push and the economic and technical models for that are worth seeing how they play out. So that's kind of like what I focus on if I focus on anything outside of the immediate, Tezos ecosystem that is, shifting and growing in its own way.
Yeah. Do you follow the latest developments in the DeFi space?
Well, I think it's basically, I think this stuff is awesome if it replicates traditional financial mechanisms and lowers the ticket price for that. I think that that's what makes this technology interesting is that it can lower the ticket price for people to use the sort of systems and mechanisms that institutions have benefited from for the last, 50, 60 years. So watching that space emerge has been fun. Unfortunately, I think, people grasped onto this being a cool idea, and now there's a ton of like, I don't know, collateralized DAI lending platform. It's just I think run amok a little bit. So I'll wait till that cools down to re-engage.
Okay, that's fair. Last question. You're based in Europe now, right?
I don't know. I float between places, but I'm basically like London, New York, and I spend some time on the West Coast if I have to.
So there's no one place
where I hang my hat.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, I'm mostly based out of airports.
Okay. And I was about to ask you about the European ecosystem for blockchain versus the American one.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I have a pretty good sense of both, I think, at this point. Well, there's a lot of, I've, for better or worse, I know a lot of, I know a lot about it. I think that in Europe it's a much different like work culture and a much different structure for capital allocation, and so it's been fun to see different like venture capital funds still continue to fund progress in the space in Europe, whereas I think in the US they've kind of chilled a little bit.
How is that different? Different in what way?
Yeah, I think basically the crypto space came in fast and hard in the U.S. And a lot of organizations that are based in the U.S. Haven't basically fulfilled their promise, and so there's been a bit of a chill in the U.S. ecosystem, and I don't see the same chill when I go to Berlin, when I go to Paris, when I go to different meetups in London. So I think there's still a lot of I think there's talent obviously in both places, but I just think culturally, if I'm doing a finger in the wind, take it with a grain of salt. There's a little bit more enthusiasm for this technology in Europe still, which took a while longer to get on board. And so I see a little bit more innovation coming out of projects in that space, whereas in the US, I do feel like there's been a bit of a chill because there were a lot of projects based in the U.S. in like 2017, 2018, when there was a lot of money going into the space, and a lot of those groups or entities didn't make good on their promises or haven't shipped anything. And I think we're seeing a consequence of that in like the venture capital space, for example, for using that as a proxy for enthusiasm.
Yeah, the biggest trend I've noticed is I think a lot of the original crypto funds or the crypto funds that have been set up in recent years have skewed more recently towards the venture model as a result of a lot of these projects not necessarily delivering on the promise or not figuring out the token economics just yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in that. I'm just more or less like giving my sense from looking for funding for my current project, right? And that gives me a good sense of who's still really interested and who's not. And it's been easier for me to source talent, and it's been easier for me to source capital from European entities, at least in like my first passes at this for my new company.
The really interesting piece here is also it feels like the blockchain ecosystem in general is more global than traditional tech, which tends to be like very much concentrated in the few hubs that we all know.
Yeah, and I think I think there's been a lot more inroads. Well, I just think in general, banking infrastructure, for example, in the UK, lends itself more towards like fintech plays and interesting fintech companies than the US banking system. So you see a lot more innovation in that front, or at least better ideas, I think, because there's more possibility. But obviously, Brexit is going to throw a wrench in that. But by and large, if I'm just going to opine freely with my very limited insight, I would say that I am more enthusiastic about teams and projects coming out of Europe in the next 2 or 3 years than I have been before.
Cool. So Kathleen, great talking with you. Really appreciate again you coming on the show. Thanks for sharing your insights.
Well, thank you for asking me about them. I'm very flattered. So thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you like this episode of the Blockchain VC and want to help bring more awareness to the space, I'd really appreciate it if you can rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. This only takes a few seconds and helps get the word out.